Hey, well, welcome to session 2 on the topic of the military, trauma, and grief and response and all that goes in that, and providing proper care, counseling, therapy for someone who has suffered through grief and loss. Again, this is an introductory session. I can't cover in great depth all the things that would be helpful for you, especially if you're a clinician or a chaplain, but hopefully it'll give you some overall information that will be, again, a good assistance for you as you work with military clients. Hey, so grief versus trauma. Grief is really the overall response to having experienced a loss or a trauma of any kind. Grief, of course, is normal, and it's an adaptation necessary for loss. The process of grieving really is what the Bible calls mourning. And as I've mentioned before, in Scripture it talks about blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. What happens to those that never mourn is they never experience the comfort. But the mourning is painful. It's not easy. There's lots of Hebrew words that speak about mourning, weeping and wailing and crying out and shaking, and all of those words kind of fit with the mourning process, which helps a person to work through the emotional aspects of grief caused by a loss, and that process, of course, is normal. I mean, I've heard it said by theologians, not so much by psychologists, but especially by some theologians in certain theological camps. They said, well, as a Christian, you should not mourn because we have the blessed hope. We know that all things work together for good to those that love God and are called according to his purpose, and a string of other scriptures that people take out of context to say that you should not have normal, healthy grief. But reality is, when you've had a significant loss, you will grieve if you're healthy. And it's essential that you grieve and that you grieve well. So it's a normal adaptation. Adaptation really is getting over, dealing with, saying goodbye to, embracing, healthy future. All of that adaptation is necessary when you've experienced a significant loss. Trauma is more of a overwhelming threat response. Now, the threat may be real, it may be imaginary, it may be past, it may be future, and it may be present. In other words, if you are driving in rush hour traffic, there's a certain level of fear or a sense of dread because there's crazy people on the road. But we have learned to manage that relatively well in order to get from point A to point B. But for some folks, because of things that have happened to them, the threat is overwhelming. The sense that something horrible is going to happen, the worst of which being death or dismemberment or disfiguration or whatever, they respond to that. So the trauma is the overwhelming threat response. I mean, I have been traumatized. I have been rejected, abandoned, betrayed, abused. I've gone through, in a military context, I did see friends wounded, die. I've experienced my own loss. And those things were not imaginary, real traumatic events. Now it is said, one man's meat's another man's poison. One person's trauma is not another. A dear friend who was in Vietnam a long time ago now, their attitude toward the war was interesting, unique, really, in many ways. He said, in the United States, we live in the normal world. In Vietnam, it's not a normal world. It's a crazy world. If you try and be normal in a crazy world, it'll drive you crazy. But if you just let the crazy come and let the crazy go, in the crazy world, you survive the crazy, and then you go back to the normal world. And for him, he was able to deal with the loss that he saw, the terrible experiences, the traumatic events that occurred during his time of combat. Well, not everybody, of course, is like that. In fact, most people are not. The trauma that they experience, they internalize. They try and process it. They try and deal with it. They try and manage the thoughts and the memories and all, but it's just overwhelming. Traumatic grief, then, is the combined impact of the loss caused, if you will, by the trauma. And it's really the inability to process that in a healthy way that becomes most problematic. It requires, a dual approach. You have to deal with both the trauma and the grief, not necessarily simultaneously, but you do have to work with both. Now, the task, if you will, for grief work, and this comes from Warden's model, starts with accepting the reality of the loss. The reality is you lost something or someone. We use a thing in therapy, you face, trace, erase, replace. You got to face the fact, the truth about a certain situation. Now you trace the cause of it. The goal is to find the reason, and sometimes that leads to why questions, but most why questions are never answered. Or the why question that's answered is because stuff happens in life, or wrong place at the wrong time, or we signed up for this. We signed up to go to war. And so what can one expect but loss? It happens. Even though we don't think of it ahead of time, we don't dream about it in that sense, but it does happen. And so, we would trace, but without a lot of why questions. There's more what questions that you ask during that time. To erase it really is the process then of grieving, saying goodbye, letting go, embracing, a new normal, if you will, in your life. Face, trace, erase. Replace it's really, especially if you think of it in a cognitive behavioral terms, it's replacing the wrong thoughts, the negative thoughts, the most difficult thoughts, if you will, with truth or a new truth. And it's really essential that you do that or be able to do that and go through that process in order to really come to a place of ultimate health. And so the process includes the processing then of pain. Grief work requires that you process pain. When we talk about process, really we're talking about talking about it or externalizing. And so you don't have to always talk about it. You can draw about it. You can create music. You can write about it. But ultimately, it's externalizing the story, externalizing the loss that one has experienced. And, that's a process. Again, everyone goes through that in different ways, different style, different timing. There's no rushing it in that sense. It's so the job of the therapist then is to come alongside someone who has experienced significant loss, grief, and they're expressing that grief, and come alongside of them and journey with them by listening and asking, not telling them what to think or how to feel or any of that, but primarily focused on helping them to just talk it through and release the emotions as they're ready to do so. So it's in many ways, it's the ministry of presence that is the most powerful as someone is processing through their pain. Ultimately, then it's the adjustment that's necessary to be able to live life without the deceased or whoever the loved one was, or whatever the loss that they've experienced. And so that adjustment takes time. There's cognitive adjustment, there's emotional adjustment, and there's many ways physical and financial adjustments that have to be made because of the loss. And then fourth, it's finding an ongoing connection while moving forward. In other words, we can't really go through this whole process alone. We need community. We need connected relationships. And so many times finding a supportive group, a local church, to help them to connect, to move beyond where the loss has taken them is a big part of it. Now, again, there's different therapeutic approaches that one can use. I tend to focus more in the area of cognitive behavioral, or trying to help people to confront the wrong belief systems or schemas that underlie their emotional responses. But there's other ways. Supportive therapy, which is really, again, what I mentioned before, it's that validation. That it's okay to feel what they feel. I think that can be very important, especially in the beginning part of counseling or psychotherapy. Is the early stage of that is really being able to just be there with them and listen and ask more reflective questions. When they say, I just feel horrible about the loss, this has been devastating for you. More reflective responses, which helps create stronger understanding and deepen relationship between therapist and client. It's validating them as a person that you are worth the time, you're worth listening to, and then just being present with them. So supportive therapy can be a very important part in the overall therapeutic process, but eventually you do need to go beyond just supportive care and actually deal with the specifics of the loss itself. So in CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, or derivatives of that, what you're addressing primarily is the guilt that often is experienced, especially survivor's guilt, with the military. I mean, the guilt is real guilt. It's not a pseudo guilt. It's not a false guilt. It's a real guilt. They really feel guilty that they did not die or were not wounded like their buddies were. They feel guilty that they can't be with their platoon or with their company in combat. They feel guilty that they're not there with their ragtag band of brothers. And so often this guilt can be overwhelming, guilt and shame, because it's not, again, not rational in that sense. It's not clear and it's not correct, but it is their perception of how things happen. And so it leads to then often distorted thoughts about what happened, what it means for them, what it says about them as a person. They can even bring up distorted theological concepts, about the goodness of God or the badness of God, and sin and loss and fate, and all of those kinds of thoughts can come up, and they can often become quite distorted. So how does that get addressed? Where, again, through our therapeutic questions and through challenging them, so you feel guilty because. Tell me about that. Let's talk about that guilt. Is that realistic? Let's use other examples of situations or circumstances where someone may have acted in a similar way, but we would not consider them to be guilty. To help them to deal with the distorted thoughts. Narrative therapy is another focus, and often I kind of blend narrative with cognitive behavioral in that I want them to find some meaning, some purpose in what they've experienced. I mean, not in the beginning stage. There doesn't seem to be, everything seems to be random in that sense. Their loss, the trauma that they've experienced, the grief that they're feeling, it all seems to be random and chaos, etc. But in the middle of all of that, there's a story to be told. If they're believers, it's helpful, obviously, because we can place their life in the grand narrative of the kingdom of God and God's call and purpose upon our lives. If they're not a believer, it's more difficult, but we're still trying to help them understand that their life has meaning and purpose. They were there in combat to serve, and yes, they've had loss, but the loss has meaning. That's why we call it sacrifice. And that sacrifice was meaningful. It did something for others. It didn't necessarily do something good for them, obviously, but it did something for others, and that has meaning. And so the narrative part becomes very, very important. And then, again, group therapy or peer support can be very, very helpful. I think it's 2 Corinthians, might be 1 Corinthians, you can look it up. Talks about comforting one another with the comfort wherewith we have been comforted by God. For in the same ways that God has comforted us, so we now can comfort others. Really what Paul is laying out to the church in Corinth is, the word comfort there is the word paraklesis. It's a kind of a lowercase word for paraclete, similar to what the Holy Spirit is called, the one who comes alongside to comfort, to give counsel, to give care. Well, paraklesis, we can comfort each other in the areas where we have already experienced comfort or care. So folks that have gone through trauma and loss and now are kind of on the, not that you ever get over it fully, but they're more on the back side of it. They process through. They're in a position to be able to say authoritatively to a fellow soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, hey, I do know what you have gone through. Not the specifics, not exactly, but I have a pretty good sense of what it's like because I've been there, done that. I own the t-shirt. It's like when I counsel men especially, but it can be men or women who have lost a loved one, especially a spouse. Having gone through that myself on 2 occasions, 2 major losses in my life, not counting my mom and dad, they got older, they died, that's life. But these were prime of life spouses who passed away due to disease and sickness, and that loss is devastating. It's traumatic. And and for a season, I thought I'd never get married again because, I don't want to have to go through that suffering. I understand that. And so when I speak to someone, even to make mention that, yes, I've buried 2 wives, to someone who has just buried a spouse, I have their attention at least. They're more likely to listen to what I have to say than to someone, even a pastor, who has not experienced a significant loss like I have. And so, again, when you're in therapy, you use what you have to try and connect and develop understanding, empathy, warmth, respect, and all of that. And so sometimes, though, peer support can be very helpful. Many times, as a primary therapist, I have given as an assignment to an individual client that they connect with certain support groups. Grief and loss, grief share, things of that nature. I almost always, if they're believers, urge them, you must connect into a home fellowship if your church offers them. And I do that simply because it's really absolutely necessary that they be able to connect with others in a healthy way. And so those are some of the major therapeutic approaches. Now, the military-specific approaches include such things as a critical incident stress debriefing. Now, again, that's happens after a trauma has occurred, where someone, usually it's a psychologist, or it can be a chaplain, or it could be any high-ranking officer, if you would, sits down and actually requires that the story be told. That sometimes is helpful, but a lot of times it's very superficial. But trying to get the details as much as possible out, talking it through, is really, really helpful. I mean, I've used this illustration in other places. I was working at one time with a psychiatrist in a treatment center for troubled kids, and he would only come up once a week, but this week he came up and he grabbed a hold of me and he said, "Hey, Stan, have I told you my story?" I said, "Well, Doc, what's the story?" He said, "Well, I was driving and I had a head-on collision. Fortunately, I wasn't physically hurt. And it was just, here's how I felt, and this is what happened. And I got back in my car the next day, and I drove that same patch of road, and basically for about 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, every time he'd come, once a week, he'd say, "Hey, did I tell you this?" "Yes, Doc, you told me this story. Let me tell it to you again." And he talked about it, and then after about, again, I think it was about 6 weeks, 8 weeks, he stopped talking about it. A few weeks later, I asked him, I said, "Did you know, you talked about your accident and the trauma and all of that, and you don't talk about it anymore." He says, "Well, I don't need to." I said, well, I talked it out. I talked it out until it didn't frighten me anymore. And I thought about that, and really that's the critical incident. Right? It's designed to talk about it, but it's never quite enough, because it's more like almost like a legal report of this is the events that happened, or a forensic analysis. But what you really need is to be able to talk it out until it's out. And that's where that therapeutic relationship can be so important. There are certain unit memorials and rituals that can be very, very helpful. And many times, to participate in those or to ensure that your client participates in those rituals can be very, very helpful. They include, again, some of them can be healthy, like a funeral, like a memorial service. Others maybe not so much, especially if they want to hit the bar and toast, 20 drinks to someone who has paid the ultimate sacrifice. Also, again, there's chaplaincy and spiritual care, which are readily provided now within military structure. It is interesting. I do remember, as a Army Reserve psychologist, I wasn't able to do active duty psychology, but as a reservist, I was more than willing, and I did work with a number of veterans, but I actually wrote a program to go to FORSCOM, it was at the time for the Army, to say, hey, there's a lot of us, psychologists, military trained, and we would be happy, we would be honored to give X amount of time, even on base or whatever, to be able to work with vets or work with active duty that have suffered trauma, to assist in the problems that they're facing, especially those that are struggling with PTSD. And I got a letter back saying thank you for the proposal. It was nicely written, how many hours and how it would work. And yeah, I was looking to be able to get some credit toward, retirement and promotion and all of that, but that wasn't the main thing. I was really interested in just helping. And a nice letter back saying we would really consider that, and we might in the future, but since we really do not have a problem now in the military with PTSD, then there's really no reason for us to consider this. And I thought, my goodness, what incredible denial. Well, there's no longer the denial within military circles. There can still be a certain askance look that some people will give toward a soldier or sailor, airman, Marine that's suffering, but by and large, the military has become very supportive, especially through chaplaincy services and care. Well, the role of the therapist is it's helpful to be, culturally competent. You need to understand a bit about what it means to be military-minded and the values that we find within the military. You need to balance then empathy with mission. That is, you have to understand the military is not about just, making people feel good. We have a mission to accomplish, and we want soldiers to be healthy. And so if you can help them get healthy, the goal is to get them back to a place where they can serve if that's possible. We need to recognize that there's often avoidance, stoicism, there's a resistance, especially to psychotherapy. But if you build trust, you present authenticity, you are able to help in a very, very effective way. Well, that's our second session. We have one more session to go, and I hope you hang in there and just recognize that working with the military, it's an honor, it's a privilege, but it's also, it's a deep and a difficult work.